Imagine walking into a room where someone holds a remote control, specifically designed, programmed, and calibrated over years to trigger your deepest insecurities. They know which button makes you defensive. They know which button makes you cry. They know exactly how to adjust the dial to make you feel like you are losing your mind. For years, every time they pressed a button, you jumped. You performed. You gave them exactly what they wanted, your emotional stability, handed over on a silver platter. But today is different. Today you walk into that exact same room, looking at that exact same person. They look at you, smile that familiar predatory smile, and they press the button. And absolutely nothing happens. They press it again, harder this time. They change the angle. They try a different button, the one that used to make you apologize for things you didn't even do. Still nothing. The machine is broken. Or rather, the receiver inside you has been completely rewired. What you are looking at in that moment is not just a standard awkward interaction. It is a profound, silent, psychological warfare event. It is the exact moment a healed empath meets a narcissist again. Most people think that when an empath heals, they become tough, cold, or aggressive. They think the healed empath walks back into the arena ready to fight, argue, or finally win the debate. That is a massive operational error. If you go back in looking for a fight, you are still playing their game. You are still feeding the machine. The real magic, the terrifying truth that keeps narcissists awake at night, is what happens when an empath returns with total, unshakable psychological immunity. When you can look at the gaslighting, the subtle insults, the shifting of blame, and instead of feeling your heart race, you feel absolutely nothing but objective curiosity. You are no longer the victim in their play. You have become the scientist, watching a lab rat run a very predictable, very sad little maze. In this speech, we are going to pull back the curtain on the hidden mechanics of this exact reunion. We are going to map out the exact psychological phases that occur when a person who relies on manipulation runs headfirst into a person who has become completely untamperable. If you have ever wondered if it's possible to face your past without losing your peace, or if you want to know the exact behavioral shifts that cause a manipulator to completely lose their grip on reality, you cannot afford to miss a single second of what comes next. Let's look at the data. Look at the person sitting across from you. If you were to map their heart rate, their microexpressions, and the slight tension in their jaw, you would see a map of their expectations. Narcissists operate entirely on a system of predictive coding. They survive by reading your vulnerabilities and predicting exactly how you will react to keep themselves in control. They are psychological hackers, and for a long time, your empathy was the open port they used to install their malware. But what happens when the software is upgraded? The reason most people fail when they face a manipulator a second time is because they try to use logic, or worse, they try to show how much they've grown by arguing. Today, I'm going to show you why the ultimate power in human behavior is not aggression, but total, unyielding psychological sovereignty. By the time we finish today, you will understand the exact mechanics of how a healed empath completely neutralizes a narcissist's entire operational playbook without saying more than 10 words. If you have ever felt the terror of being pulled back into someone's web, pay close attention. The power dynamic is about to flip permanently. The return of the observer. When a healed empath meets a narcissist again, the narcissist immediately boots up the old operating system. They will use the exact same vocal tones, the same subtle jabs disguised as jokes, or the same dramatic stories designed to make you feel pity. They are testing the boundaries to see if the old levers still work. But a healed empath doesn't react, they observe. In behavioral profiling, we talk about the baseline, a person's normal state of operation. The healed empath now views the narcissist's behavior the same way an engineer views a dashboard code. When the narcissist says something designed to sting, The healed empath's internal dialogue isn't, "How could they say that to me?" Instead, it is, "Ah, there is the devaluation phase. Fascinating." You see, the moment you stop absorbing the emotion and start analyzing the behavior, the narcissist loses all their power. You are no longer a participant in their drama. You are a spectator watching a very old, very repetitive movie. When the narcissist realizes their usual tricks aren't working, a highly predictable psychological phenomenon occurs: narcissistic injury. They expect a reaction. They need your anger to prove you are crazy, or your tears to prove they control you. When you respond with nothing but a polite, calm, and completely blank stare, you create a psychological vacuum. Silence is a mirror. To a person with a fragile manufactured ego, there is nothing more terrifying than a mirror that refuses to distort itself to make them look big. The narcissist will begin to escalate. They might try a massive compliment to hook you, or a massive insult to break you. In human behavior, this is called an extinction burst. The sudden explosion of a behavior right before it stops because it's no longer getting rewarded. The healed empath recognizes this explosion for what it is: a sign of desperate weakness, not strength. The interaction ends not because the narcissist wins, but because they run out of fuel. A narcissist cannot survive in an environment where they are fully seen but completely unfeared. When you heal, you don't build a wall to keep people out. You build a solid center so that whatever crosses your path simply bounces off. When a healed empath meets a narcissist again, it is the narcissist who leaves the interaction feeling confused, exhausted, and fundamentally exposed. You do not need to expose them to the world. You do not need to yell at them or prove them wrong. Your absolute, unbothered peace is the ultimate exposure. You have recoded your mind, closed the ports, and reclaimed your sovereignty. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a game they can never, ever win. The paradigm shift of the reentry is fundamentally an operational transition from a state of emotional participation to a state of clinical observation. In the past, the dynamic between the empath and the manipulator was governed by a predictable destructive feedback loop. The empath entered every interaction with an open posture, burdened by the innate desire to fix, to understand, to gain closure, or to finally secure an apology that was never going to materialize. This desire was a vulnerability, a psychological port that allowed the manipulator to gain access, install doubt, and control the narrative. The empath's internal state was reactive, meaning their heart rate, cognitive focus, and emotional stability were constantly fluctuating based on the behavioral inputs of the other person. They were a participant inside the matrix of the manipulator's design, reading from a script that had been meticulously written to ensure their ultimate submission. When reentry occurs after true internal healing, that entire matrix collapses. The healed empath does not walk into the room with an armored chest or a weaponized attitude. They walk in with absolute clinical detachment. They have completely abandoned the illusion that the manipulator will ever change, acknowledge reality, or offer accountability. Consequently, the need for validation vanishes. When you no longer require a person to validate your reality, that person completely loses the ability to define it. The healed empath shifts from a target into a profiler. Instead of processing the words spoken as literal truth or personal attacks, they process them purely as behavioral metrics, tracking vocal syntax, micro-expressions, pacing, and postural shifts to map out exactly what the manipulator is trying to achieve in real time. Consider the profound shift in internal chemistry during this confrontation. In previous interactions, a subtle insult or a classic gaslighting technique would immediately trigger the empath's autonomic nervous system. The heart rate would spike, cortisol would flood the system, and the brain would enter a defensive fight or flight state, forcing them to argue, explain, or apologize. This physiological reaction was precisely what the manipulator was farming for. It was the emotional currency required to sustain their fragile ego. During a healed re-entry, however, the empath's baseline remains entirely undisturbed. When the manipulator drops a familiar conversational landmine, the healed empath's nervous system stays completely regulated. They look at the behavior objectively, identifying the exact tactic being deployed. They note the devaluation attempt, the projection, or the sudden pivot to victimhood, as if they are watching a predictable chemical reaction in a controlled laboratory setting. This total shift in perspective completely scrambles the manipulator's predictive coding. A manipulator relies entirely on the assumption that your behavior can be predicted and controlled through specific emotional levers. They press a button, and they expect a specific yield of emotional distress or defensive explanation. When they press that button and encounter a calm, analytical observer who is simply tracking the trajectory of the attempt, the power dynamic is instantly inverted. The healed empath is no longer trapped in the emotional undercurrent of the relationship. They have stepped onto the high ground of objective reality. They see the manipulation clear as day, not as a devastating personal betrayal, but as a rigid, primitive defense mechanism belonging to someone who is fundamentally trapped in their own pathology. This objective tracking changes everything, turning what used to be a psychological trap into a harmless, transparent display of predictable human behavior. The mirage of the new script is a phenomenon that occurs when a narcissist attempts to initiate contact, relying entirely on a deeply ingrained, cyclical behavioral loop designed to regain control. This loop is a highly predictable three-part matrix consisting of charm, slight degradation, and psychological gaslighting. In the initial phase of the re-entry, the narcissist will almost always present a new script, a polished, altered version of themselves designed to exploit the empath's natural inclination toward hope and reconciliation. They may appear remarkably humble, highly reflective, or suddenly burdened by an overwhelming sense of nostalgia. They use soft vocal tones, calculated pauses, and manufactured vulnerability to project the illusion that profound internal change has occurred. This is the bait. It is a simulated reality designed to trick the observer into lowering their psychological guard, opening up the emotional ports that were previously sealed through intense self-work and healing. However, because this new script is a performance rather than a product of genuine introspection, it lacks systemic stability. A narcissist cannot sustain a simulated baseline of humility or empathy for an extended period because it yields no emotional return for them. The moment the healed empath refuses to read from the old script, the moment they refuse to match the narcissist's emotional frequency, offer praise, or fall into the trap of sentimental reconciliation, the narcissist's baseline matrix begins to rapidly destabilize. The manipulator expects their target to play a specific, pre-assigned role in this theater: the grateful recipient of the apology, the defensive apologist, or the emotional wreck. When the empath remains entirely neutral, responding to the performance with polite clinical indifference, the narcissist experiences a severe cognitive glitch. The predictive coding they rely on to navigate interpersonal dynamics completely fails to process the lack of emotional data returning from the empath. As this destabilization takes root, the mirage of the new script begins to crack, exposing the rigid, primitive mechanics underneath. Because the charm phase failed to produce the desired submission or emotional supply, the narcissist is forced to rapidly accelerate through their behavioral loop to force a reaction. The transition from manufactured warmth to subtle, underhanded degradation happens almost instantly. A passive-aggressive comment is slipped into the conversation, a past failure is casually weaponized, or a subtle shift in body language is deployed to induce anxiety. In a normal dynamic, this sudden shift would cause the empath to experience whiplash, sending them spiraling into a desperate attempt to fix the vibe or defend their character. But the healed empath sees this acceleration as a vital data point. They recognize that the narcissist hasn't changed at all. The manipulator has simply run through their initial tactical options and is now defaulting to aggression because their primary tool of deception failed. When the degradation also fails to penetrate the empath's psychological immunity, the narcissist resorts to the final stage of the loop: gaslighting and overt reality distortion. They will rewrite the history of the current interaction in real time, accusing the empath of being cold, hostile, or unforgiving, despite the empath remaining perfectly calm and polite. This rapid decay from charm to chaos is the ultimate proof of the mirage. The narcissist's entire operational playbook relies on the empath staying stuck in the old rhythm of the relationship. By refusing to validate the fake script, the healed empath forces the narcissist to unmask themselves, revealing that behind the new words and the temporary mask of growth lies the exact same predatory pattern, completely unchanged and utterly powerless against a mind that can no longer be fooled. The power of behavioral mirroring and clean boundaries manifests as a masterclass in tactical stillness, changing the entire topography of the interaction from a chaotic emotional storm into a highly controlled psychological lab. When a healed empath encounters a narcissist, the narcissist immediately attempts to leverage emotional volatility. They throw conversational darts, use provocative posture shifts, and intentionally drop highly charged phrases designed to trigger an immediate, defensive, and highly emotional reaction. In the past, the empath would absorb this toxic energy, allowing their own nervous system to match the chaotic frequency of the manipulator, which inevitably resulted in a messy, draining argument where the empath always lost ground. Tactical stillness flips this dynamic on its head. Instead of absorbing the incoming emotional payload, the healed empath allows it to pass completely through the space, remaining as unbothered, steady, and immovable as a boulder in a rushing river. This absolute stillness acts as a pristine behavioral mirror. When you refuse to react to a provocation, you do not absorb the toxicity. Instead, you reflect it directly back onto the person who projected it. Without an emotional reaction to feed on, the narcissist's behavior is left completely exposed in the room, stripped of the smoke and mirrors of a mutual argument. If a person yells at you or drops a deeply passive-aggressive insult, and your response is a calm, prolonged pause, accompanied by an objective, unblinking look, the absurdity and malice of their behavior becomes undeniable, even to them. The healed empath treats every single provocation not as a personal assault on their character, but purely as an objective data point. They decode the subtext of the attack in real time, recognizing that the narcissist's anger is a direct measurement of their inability to manipulate the current environment. Simultaneously, clean boundaries are deployed, not as a desperate defense mechanism or a loud, angry statement, but as quiet, unyielding, and non-negotiable laws of physics. Weak boundaries require constant defending, arguing, and explaining. Clean boundaries, wrapped in Chase Hughes' style of operational precision, require absolutely no justification. They are stated clearly, calmly, and exactly once, with a completely neutral vocal tone that communicates absolute certainty. If the narcissist attempts to cross that line, shift the blame, or rewrite history, the healed empath does not engage in a debate to prove their point. They simply restate the boundary or calmly terminate the interaction without a shred of anger or hesitation. There is no emotional leakage, no nervous fidgeting, and no micro-expressions of fear or resentment. There is only a stone-cold wall of self-possession. This specific combination of tactical stillness and clean boundaries creates an immediate psychological crisis for the manipulator. Narcissists read people by tracking their vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities always leak through emotional reactions, defensiveness, and over-explaining. When met with an empath who displays zero emotional leakage and an unshakable physiological baseline, the narcissist suddenly finds themselves completely blind. They can no longer read the room, they can no longer predict the next move, and they can no longer find an entry point to exploit. Every tactical strike they attempt simply hits a solid shield of indifference and bounces right back to injure their own fragile ego. By stepping out of the emotional arena and into the role of the objective observer, the healed empath completely neutralizes the narcissist's offensive strategy, forcing them to operate in a vacuum where their old weapons have absolutely no effect. The collapse of the narcissistic supply is the critical turning point where the manipulator's entire psychological framework suffers a catastrophic system failure. Narcissists do not view people as independent human beings. They view them as external power sources designed to feed an insatiable, fragile ego. This fuel, known as narcissistic supply, comes in two distinct forms: positive supply, which includes admiration, validation, and overt attention, and negative supply, which consists of anger, tears, frantic defensiveness, and emotional chaos. To a manipulator, negative supply is often just as valuable as praise, because causing a profound emotional reaction in another person provides definitive, measurable proof of their power and dominance over that individual's reality. For years, the empath's natural tendency to over-explain, feel deep guilt, and react with intense emotional distress served as an elite, high-yield fuel source that sustained the narcissist's artificial sense of superiority. When a healed empath enters the equation, this vital fuel supply is instantly and completely cut off. The empath's internal alignment is so thoroughly anchored in objective reality that they no longer possess the emotional receptors required to process the narcissist's psychological hooks. When the narcissist deploys a carefully calibrated insult or a dramatic guilt trip, instead of encountering a soft, reactive target, they slam into a wall of absolute indifference. The healed empath does not argue, does not cry, does not defend their honor, and does not show even a flicker of resentment in their micro-expressions. This lack of response creates an immediate, terrifying psychological vacuum for the manipulator. Because their entire identity is a hollow construct that requires constant external reflection to exist, running out of supply is not just a mild annoyance. It is an existential threat that induces an acute state of psychological starvation. As the supply line drops to zero, the narcissist's behavioral patterns begin to wildly erraticize in a desperate bid to force a reaction. In behavioral science, when a reinforced behavior suddenly stops producing the expected reward, the subject enters an extinction burst, which manifests as a rapid, chaotic escalation of tactics. The narcissist will quickly cycle through their entire repertoire, switching from calculated charm to intense gaslighting, and finally to overt aggression within a matter of minutes. They are looking for any crack in the empath's armor, any sigh, any sudden shift in posture, or any defensive phrase that signals they have finally broken through. But when the healed empath maintains their unshakable baseline, refusing to provide even a single drop of emotional currency, the vacuum intensifies, plunging the narcissist into a state of profound cognitive dissonance. Faced with an unyielding vacuum, the narcissist's carefully constructed mask completely disintegrates, forcing them into one of two desperate operational maneuvers: retreat or a total, uncontrolled unmasking. Realizing that this specific target has become completely untamperable and offers absolutely zero return on investment, the narcissist's survival instinct kicks in. They cannot remain in an environment that constantly exposes their powerlessness, as it risks triggering a deep, debilitating narcissistic mortification. Consequently, they will either abruptly flee the interaction to search for an easier, more compliant source of fuel elsewhere, or they will completely lose control, exposing their raw, unedited malice for the entire room to see. By simply remaining completely aligned and denying them the emotional currency they crave, the healed empath forces the manipulator to consume themselves in their own vacuum. Absolute sovereignty as the ultimate weapon marks the final, irreversible shift where the healed empath achieves total psychological immunity, rendering the narcissist completely obsolete. In the early stages of a survivor's journey, healing is often mistakenly viewed through the lens of combat. People believe that to heal means to become strong enough to defeat the narcissist, to expose their lies in a public forum, or to deliver a devastating verbal blow that finally shatters their fragile ego. This perspective is a critical trap because any desire to fight, avenge, or defeat a manipulator is still an emotional attachment. It signals to the manipulator that they still possess a direct line to your internal world, and that their presence still dictates your behavior. True sovereignty is not about winning the war against the narcissist. It is about completely stepping off the battlefield and rendering the war itself entirely irrelevant. This level of sovereignty is achieved when an individual reaches a state of internal alignment so profound that the narcissist's behavioral levers no longer have a matching slot to fit into. A lever requires a fulcrum to work. It needs a specific hook within your psychology, such as a fear of abandonment, a compulsive need for approval, an unhealed wound of inadequacy, or a toxic sense of guilt. When you do the deep, painful work of healing, you systematically identify every single one of these internal vulnerabilities and close them up. You validate your own reality, secure your own worth, and anchor your peace inside your own skin. When you walk back into an interaction with a manipulator with this level of internal completion, they can pull their usual levers with maximum force, but there is simply no mechanisms left inside you for those levers to catch onto. They are spinning their wheels in empty air. From an operational standpoint, this immunity changes the very nature of what is occurring in the room. The healed empath is no longer exercising massive amounts of willpower to stay calm. They are not white-knuckling their way through the conversation or suppressing a boiling rage. Suppressing an emotion still takes immense psychological energy, and a skilled profiler can see that tension leaking out through micro-expressions, rapid breathing, or a rigid posture. True sovereignty is effortless. It is the quiet, relaxed ease of a person who is looking at a minor, predictable storm from behind a sheet of bulletproof glass. The narcissist's words, tactics, and projections do not even register as an attack. They are viewed simply as ambient noise. The empath's heartbeat remains perfectly rhythmic, their breathing stays deep and steady, and their cognitive bandwidth remains completely free. This effortless indifference is the most devastating weapon imaginable against a narcissistic structure. A narcissist can handle your anger because anger means they still matter to you. They can handle your hatred because hatred is just love turned inside out, and it still requires you to expend your life force thinking about them. What a narcissist absolutely cannot survive is your genuine, absolute indifference. When they look into your eyes and realize that you do not hate them, you do not love them, and you do not fear them, that you simply view them as an objective, irrelevant element of the environment, their entire illusion of control evaporates.